Hello. Thank you for joining us this evening or this afternoon. That was already, it's all dark here, so I'm all in the night. um, so this is the third workshop that we have today, and this is going to be on how to use internships to impact your employment goals. And again, this is not necessarily sort of a process map or a step map. It's kind of looking at what is your take. It's basically what I've been chatting about in other workshops today about trying to formalize a little bit more what is the plan of attack. And so we'll be doing an exercise in here, which is, I may ask you to share out at the end, but for now, just be prepared that I'm going to ask you to answer some questions. So get a piece of paper and a pen just to write things down. And if you feel like sharing after we've gone through this, the presentation, I'd be more than happy to hear a little bit more about like what you, how this has been helpful to you or what you're thinking in reference to some of these internship questions we're going through. All right, so let's do one more grounding exercise. So everybody close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Think of a place in nature, something that's meaningful to you, whether it be in a mountain, water, or desert. Bring your family and your friends in, relatives that mean a lot to you. Ask them to join you in the space. See them, acknowledge them, thank them for coming. And then think about people who have passed, other family, elders, mentors who've gone on. Ask them to come and join you and be a part of your thinking today and join this space with you. Thank them for coming. And then think of the land that you're on, acknowledge the rocks, the mountains, the trees, the plants, animals, anything that you see. Be appreciative. Thank them all for being there. Thank them for being a part of your space, your grounding space. Take a deep breath. And then acknowledge the sun, whether it's rising, whether it's setting, whether it's in the middle of the sky. Just work to be present with that sun, with that light. Thank it for being here and thank it for showing up, and ask it to be helpful for your learning today. All right. So let's go ahead and start here where we talked a little bit about internships. Again, just to remind us, internships, change the way you see and believe in yourself. Internships offer both informal and formal mentoring opportunities. Internships help develop a sense of work, and internships help develop meaning. So the way that I'm centering this talk is to talk a little bit more about like if you're thinking of like what it is that I want to do and how an internship can sort of be useful pragmatically, I'll highlight this a little bit at the end, not too dramatically, but if you do an internship, you learn a lot about yourself. You learn a lot about working in professional environments. You learn a lot about your specific, tasks, professionalism, competencies, skills. So there's great benefit to it. But one of the things that we never sort of harness enough is how the relationships that you make at an internship inform and can support a little bit more of your planning for the objective of your career path or employment path or position path. People are helpful. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I think too, the thing that's most meaningful that we understand is that internships help ground a person think about a reality that may or may not be close by, or just sort of think about, the way that they're thinking about their future. And how do you help yourself sort of do that work as another part of this presentation too. And then, another part is to think about, to acknowledge really that an internship really is a pathway to employment if you think, incorporate all of the components into what is happening while you're there, and being helpful to sort of thinking of the objective, as Leola mentioned in the last presentation, I think, or the one before, having conversations with other people, finding out more about the business, and then, if the one internship that you are not doing is not the right one, then how do you think about maybe someplace else in the company to connect to? And that was actually mentioned in our first presentation of the day. So I'm going to start here again to talk about our coaching framing. Reciprocity is in the middle, centering that reality that many people want to help their communities, and then what does that mean, and what are some of the processes that have to happen. The acknowledgement of self and ways of being. Storytelling is kind of where we'll go next, and sort of think critically about what happens and how do you incorporate the experiences that you get from internships into some of the things listed there. Relationality is the actual internship sort of exploration, doing something, learning a little bit more about like what you can and cannot do, and then the ways of knowing, becoming something of a useful tool or mechanism to help other people sort of explore their realities as they move forward. Excuse me. So at the core, this is sort of the framing and getting a little deeper into some of the objectives. And so what I'll give you a few minutes to do is just to sort of look at this slide, core, reciprocity, your values. So I want you to think about and map out, just write out some terms like, what do you know about yourself? So do you like working with children? Do you like nature? Do you like space? Do you like food? And how can that sort of, translate into a construct of value? Or does it inform you often enough to sort of think about those interest points, those things that can be turned into a value? So take a minute to write down a few things or think of something. And then think about the concept of service, like what do you want to give back? We'll do a more specific exercise in the next slide, but what I want you to think about is like, what does that mean? Service, being able to be helpful. How do you want to do that? Do you want to be a person who talks? Do you want to be a person who organizes? Do you want to be a person who offers a service? Do you see yourself in some other role? You could even say a leader position, chair, council, running a business, however those things seem to be of use to you. So take a minute to write at least one thing down so that at least you can sort of like harness that a little bit more. And then I want you to think of, and you don't have to really write anything down to these two pieces, to these two questions, like what makes you happy and what motivates and energizes you, because it is centering these two questions of like, what do you know about yourself and what do you want to give back? Like, how will this sort of energize you, and how will this sort of motivate your happiness, or inform, or increase, or drive? Cooking for elders makes me happy because it reminds me of doing something for my grandma, just sort of like thinking about that construct in the way that I've asked that question. And so now let's, when I talk about centering reciprocity, and, this seems to be a really good way of inviting students to think more critically, or people to think more critically about, like, what does that mean? I try to build this reciprocity narrative, or give them a way to sort of understand, like, how does this work for them? So, the easy, usually, well, this isn't the easiest. It's easier than the last question for sure. But the first question, I want you to take a moment and think critically about, like, what do you want to give back to the world? So I want to be able to be a resource to climate change. I want to be an advocate for missing people. I want to be helpful for growing economies, rights, human, indigenous, whatever. To write down one thing about, like, what do you want to give back to the world? And then the second question is, like, what do you want to give back to your community? And, community is a term that you get to decide on. It could be your tribe, it could be your family, it could be a city, it could be a native community in the middle of Chicago. So it doesn't necessarily have to be completely entrenched in reservation life or something along those lines. It could be, a gaming society. It could be, I don't know, actors, nurses, whatever. So just think about, like, what you want to give back to that environment. Whether it's support, more time, more effort, more money. I don't know. Even that's a good thing. Community people love that. I would gladly accept money from any of you if you want to give me money. And then what do you want to give back to yourself? And this is always the hardest part, because this is a part of the thing that internships sort of harness. Like your education, your ability to be more confident, a stronger voice, more knowledge, sort of defining that so that you get a better idea of, like, okay, I'm in this picture in addition to everyone else. Because what happens a lot of the time for people who have this drive to be helpful to their community or give back in reciprocity is that they begin to think that it's their job and their birthright to save everyone around them, which is not true. It is basically to be helpful to finding out who you are so that you become useful, and then people get a chance to see who you are, and then you find your place in the world so that you're able to show up in a way that's useful to the community and to the world. But you have to be involved in that. So write one thing down. If you can do 2 or 3, that's even better, just to sort of help you get that more situated. All right, so now we get to a little bit more of the boring part of this presentation. So one thing that I think I want to highlight is that, we've been talking a little bit about skills, picking an internship to build skills. And there are many number of ways to sort of think about how to decide on what type of internship you want. And I think that, this is one that I still think rises to the top, because ultimately people view internships as primary targets of employment. So they want to learn things and they use this environment to grow in some way. So, thinking about, like, what are the hard skills and the soft skills? Hard skills are pretty much like, things that you can quantify by doing, and I think typing speed is a really good idea. Being able to sell over $5,000 in less than 3 hours is a hard skill. When you think of soft skills, being able to talk to people and communicate and be able to influence people, those are soft skills that help you define your hard skills. So you can see how they interchange. And, things that I like to, I've used this framework because these are ways of thinking about how to categorize the structuring for a resume. But I also think that too, when we begin to sort of construct our resumes, thinking of values like respect, reciprocity, responsibility, and what's the other one? Relationships. I think that those two play into here as well. Soft skills, I think relationship is a soft skill. But it also can turn into like a hard skill. Because when you work in relationships and build community, you learn how to talk, you learn how to do public speaking sometimes, you learn how to communicate. And when you do that, the process of relationship building over time takes many forms. And so it's a very strong communication centered, reality. So in that you can think of communication outlets like emails, being able to email well, being able to write a short email versus a long email, verbose, no grammar, just sort of thinking critically about like there is something strong within relationship building that is both very pragmatically hard skilled, but there's also something very strong and useful in reference to sort of thinking about soft skills. So even trying to master your capacity to put values into these frameworks is super helpful. And I think that that's a very strong piece too, to sort of get to the storytelling of who you are. And something that we try to do at the College Fund is to center storytelling. And so I think that trying to magically take away the professionalism of these different spaces is very hard, because what happens for students and what happens for career advisors and people who are working with students is that we think that there's a formula for all of these things that you have to master for them to be appropriate or to be successful. If you can just think about them and let them sort of flow over you, and you begin to sort of understand storytelling in the way that you talk about yourselves, because I'm going to center this in a very powerful way that I heard from one of my former students. And she was talking to a group of students at the Alaska Federation of Natives at a conference a couple of years ago, where, she told a group of young people, if it feels like bragging, then it probably is. So stop it. But if it feels like you're telling me a little bit more about what you want to do and how you want to do it, and what you're passionate about, and how you want to show up in the world, and how you want to be useful. She goes, that stuff is not bragging, because you're telling me like a little bit about who you are. You're telling me about like things that you know about yourself. You're telling me about things that you want to grow and where you want to go. If you want to save whales, or the capacity for Alaska Natives to be able to hunt whales, she goes, does that sound like bragging? I don't think so. It just sounds like there's something about that you want to do. And I need to know that, because if I'm in a position to be helpful, then I could really be helpful. So just know that, when you're using words and you're doing these things, it shouldn't be difficult or hard to tell people about the things that you want to do, and the things that you know about what you can do, and the things that you know about what you can't do. And that is a skill that I think is really valuable to think of when you're trying to build your elevator speech, your cover letter, and your resume. Because, what happens in a resume is that it is used to sort of look at and assess you quickly. And so what you're doing is you are selling yourself, but the thing is that you don't have to show up in a way that seems, less authentic. You could talk literally about what it is that you learned and what you think you're very capable of. In a cover letters I think are misunderstood because they're people um use them sometimes to sort of promote aspects of themselves in ways that are maybe true or not true. But the thing that is really useful about a cover letter is that it gives you an opportunity for you to share a little deeper about how you operationalize and experience your skill in a very pragmatic way. So let's say, I wrote down in my resume, I worked for this nonprofit, I managed a budget of this much, and I did all these things. I, worked with a team of this many people, and I created X, Y, and Z productivity, blah, blah, blah. In a cover letter, and let's say that I'm applying to be a leader in that position or that role doing the same stuff, I get an opportunity to say, like, I had an opportunity to work with our team, and what I did is I um, brought them together, had a conversation so that we could develop a concept or whatever. And what we did is we drafted a concept, and then I worked with community partners to think critically about, like, if we were to do this project, like, how can we do that? And then I applied for grant funding, and we received, up to $1.5 million to do this workshop and to do some follow-up. And, this is what we created. And my role in that was to do X, Y, and Z. So you can hear the difference in reference to sort of talking a little bit about, like, the bragging part versus just sort of matter of factly telling people what I did. Because I don't think anything I wrote or shared is doing too much about blowing up me. It's just saying, like, hey, this is what I did. Because the important part about that is that you're communicating, like, how you work with people, how you were able to sort of take something from an idea to put it into practice, and how then you were able to then get it funded because you're able to communicate what this ideal could look like, and then you were able to draft it into a framework that people understood and were like, we are really excited about this and we want to give you money for them. So all of that sort of talks about a skill set that may not show up sometimes in the way that you're drafting your resume. So think about, like, the way that you're telling your story. And that's the same thing about elevator speeches, because, when we talk about for example, so I worked with a group of students and they're ambassadors. We called them our college fund ambassadors. And I brought a group of them. Well, I was asked to join a group of them in New York for our annual gala. And I knew the stories of enough of them that it was pretty easy for me to sort of, like, find people for them to chat about. But some of the objective for me were find resources for students that could be helpful for their long game in reference to employment, find resources for students in case they wanted to develop a project. And so I was just listening to some of the people who were at the gala, and I was like, oh, how interesting that that's what you do, and that's what you're looking forward to do, and you want to know more about that. And I'm like, give me a minute, let me go and find a student. And so I would come back and I found a couple of people that I'm like, hey, you need to go and talk to this woman because this is what she does and this is what she funds. And I know that that's right up your alley. You're talking about education, and she's been talking about it this way. So maybe there's something in there. And so we had worked with the students to talk a little bit or build a little, framing of themselves so that when they meet people, they could just sort of share. And so she walked up and she said, Jack told me that you work in education. Well, this is what I do. And I'm very curious about, like, how this fits, because he thought that there would be some sort of, component or relationship, whatever. And she basically just said, like, okay, so I'm a mom, I'm a growing teacher. I live out in the middle of nowhere. I'm working, at a middle school, and I'm trying to get to the high school because I want to do some more counseling type work, but I'm also really appreciating working in our immersion school. And I'm trying to figure out, like, how is that going to sort of lead to a bigger picture of me becoming, a professional. That could be teaching, that could be administrator. I like the idea of running an immersion program because it's just what I've learned is so great. And that was pretty much her elevator speech. And again, there's not a lot of bragging in there. It's just like, hey, this is what I do. So when you're thinking about how internships and play into your larger picture, that's kind of the language that it should be working to inform. It should be helpful for you to tell more about you-ness versus you about like all of the stuff that you're you're thinking we want to hear. Because, I had a student once and, he was going to, school for a culinary degree, and I was really like, why are you doing that? And he, many times I kept asking him because he kept telling me these rote responses, and I'm like, that's not it. And then finally he listened to a couple of students share, and then he's like, okay, well, this is the real story. And I said, okay, what? And I said, he said, I was homeless for a while, and what I really want to do is to like learn how to cook so I can understand how to create a cookbook or some sort of like teaching structure to help people learn how to use eat garbage in a nutritional way. Like, is there a way that we can do that? Because I don't think anybody helps those people who are homeless like find dignity in that space. And they have to eat, and I just want to be helpful to that. Pretty amazing. And I was like, wow, that's pretty powerful. And I said, why did you not want to tell me that? And he said, well, I was embarrassed. I'm like, why? He's like, I don't know. He's like, I don't want people to know I'm homeless. And I'm like, okay, I understand that. And he goes, but also the reason why I want to get a culinary degree is and learn this is to do that for sure. But he goes, then I want to open up a restaurant. So that was not untrue because he shared that earlier. He goes, but I want to own a restaurant so I can learn how to build, the capacity to feed the homeless of Albuquerque. And I was like, okay, that sounds even better. And I'm like, are you telling anybody about this? And he said, no. And I said, why not? And he's like, well, because I don't want anybody to know that I'm homeless. And I'm like, but you're not homeless now, and you are in school and you're working to do something that's pretty amazing. And then I asked a group of 30 students in the room, like, would you fund this guy if he wrote this in an application or told you about this? And every one of them raised their hand and said yes. I said, so you have to figure out, how do you do that work from all of the experiences that you're taking on? And that's what storytelling really means when it comes to these spaces. For personal statements, and these are when you draft an essay to sort of apply to predominantly graduate programs, but they kind of surface in other ways too. And I'll talk a little bit about this philosophy statement. So when you're thinking about personal statements and you're furthering your degree and your career, again, those aren't really about like bragging about yourself or telling people who you are. They're more about like, I have an interest to sort of change the world in this way. And I know that in my voice and my research, I've been able to understand climate change enough to sort of be helpful. But what I don't know is, if I'm going to be helpful in this way through climate change, then I need to know these things. And I think that your institution can be helpful to be doing that. And I know that you have a record of being performative in these areas. You have these faculty, these staffs. So you have to be helpful to yourself to sort of get to what you know, but then you have to tell people what you don't know so that they can understand like how they can be helpful. And that's a really great practice for many people just in general, because it feeds all of the other stuff, because you want to be able to step into an environment where you seem competent, but you also want to let that environment know that you're competent enough to be helpful, but you also feel like you can grow in many ways. And for the philosophy statement, this is for jobs like teaching and other positions. We were asked to sort of tell me, when you're applying for fellowships and other professional development grants, sometimes they'll ask for this, and it's sort of the same thing. Like, why do you do the thing that you do? I was asked to write a philosophy statement for an application I was submitting to run a department at an institution, and they basically asked me for my teaching philosophy. And that's like So I believe in open door policy. I believe in students have the answer, just sort of driving a little bit of the knowledge of who you are. So you have to know a little bit more of the language that you use in describing yourself. And these are ways to practice so that you can be better about being able, not so much to like be competitive, but just sort of show the world like how two things. I know who I am, but I also know like how I want to be helpful. And if you could be of use to that, I would really love to have a conversation with you. And that's the reason why I go back to this space here, because if you can sort of harness the things that you know about how you want to give back, they can help draft a really good dialogue about moving forward and being useful to a number of spaces. And then learning like what I don't know. So when you're thinking about that and you're building those spaces internally within those positions, some of the resources that are available are really not understood when you don't consider the relationships. Because, many of the students that I work with now talk about how former internship mentors and colleagues now are either mainstay colleagues or they're still useful in being helpful to some of the problems that many of these people have had to face. Many of the students that I worked with have maintained relationships with many of the students that they were participating in internships with. And, you when you think about trying to find those people and meet them, you can be a little conniving, and be thoughtful about it, and trying to say, because there seems to be a lot, and I don't necessarily know if I agree with it, but I think that there's some scholarship that says, you basically reflect some of the people who you're around most of the time. So, like, how do you build a network of people that hold your interest, values, the way that you see an industry, the way that maybe even they work, and maybe the information that you want to share or they want to share, and then your future, because all of the things are super important enough to sort of think about as you're developing as a professional, but operationalizing them, one or two of them in a constant as you begin to sort of do your community building and your networking, because ultimately what a network is and what the action of networking is building community. And you do that by sharing and doing story with them. So when you do your elevator pitch and when you do your cover letter, and when you begin to talk a little bit more about like your personal reality and who you are, like that story, that's meaningful, that's deep, that's a part of who you are. And you need to treat these documents in that way, because they are the only way that people are going to see you sometimes. For not knowing you, you're walking right off the street in some situations, and there's no need for you to be not present and real in those documents. And so learning how to do that with people will also learn to teach you how to do that as you begin to sort of, grow your capacity to sort of influence the way that the world around you and the way that you see yourself in reference to giving back. And so a couple of things, and this is the last slide because there's not a lot of information I think in here other than sort of driving you to be more critical about the way that you want to show up in that internship search or employment search, is that these are things that we know. 7 out of 10 employers offer their on-site interns a full-time job. One thing that happened often with the students that I worked with in DC is that they were still in their degree programs and people were saying, we want to hire them. I'm like, no, you can't. They have to finish their degree. Stop it. So there is a high need, because you do relationship building, you do a lot of deep dive and training, you do understand a little bit more about the way that operation or that office corporation functions in reference to just the day-to-day, also the culture. So if it doesn't match or if it doesn't fit, then you need to leave. But people are going to extend you an opportunity to stay there because you just have been there enough, and they don't have to do a lot of and you don't have to do a lot of soul searching and trying to figure out, is this going to work or is this relationship useful? And another thing, like 85% of employers offered a full-time position after a virtual internship. This is a new statistic because many people are talking about like the need to have an in-person relationship or connection to sort of make that a tangible outcome. But this is a really wonderful statistic to think about, is that even though you are not in an office, you still can build a strong enough connection with people in that organization that they were willing to sort of put all of their eggs in one basket with you. And I think too that, we hired Adriana when we were in pandemic, and when we came together, like it wasn't but 5 minutes and here we were laughing our faces off. So it's like, it's a very interesting dynamic to think about how organizations are now incorporating other ways of connecting. Another thing too is that we're on Zoom, we're on virtual spaces all the time. So that thinking of in person doesn't always have to be as clear or defined to sort of know that you could be of service to a community, a corporation, a business, or yourself. And then another statistic that I pulled out because I thought it was interesting is that, college graduates who intern have up to 12% higher salaries than those who didn't. And I don't necessarily know if that's always at the core of students, native students specifically, making their choices of job or job tracks. But it's just nice to know that you could enter into a position with an ability to have to negotiate a salary. And I think there's nothing more confident than being able to know, like, I could ask for this and I know that I can deliver this. But even just sort of coming in and saying, here's my capacity, my ability, this is what I think I can do. And they give you an offer, and then you're like, okay, but I think that I could do it. And would you be willing to do it at this level? And they respond with, yes, we can. So know that experience, relationships, and just sort of being able to communicate and do storytelling about yourself are all of the things that make up a reality of this is what employment could, this is attractive employment for sure. And I think that's why, I've been pushing how to align an internship to like where you want to end up. Although that doesn't have to be the sole reason or objective, it is nice to know that if you have an idea that you want to work in sustainability or you want to work in psychology, that you have got some experience somewhere in there that could be helpful to that. And you don't have to, beat around the bush or try to create, a story that may or may not be true because you've done something that sort of fits where you're projecting yourself going in the future. So that is pretty much all I have.